Welcome to Asian Centuries. For regular updates and bonus material, subscribe for our newsletter at asiancenturiespod.substack.com, or you can listen on your favorite podcast app or find episodes on YouTube. Just search Asian Centuries Podcast. I hope you enjoy the show. We declared war on America and Britain out of our sincere desire to ensure Japan's self-preservation and the stabilization of East Asia, it far being from our fault either to infringe upon the sovereignty of other nations or to embark upon territorial aggrandizement. But now the war has lasted for nearly 4 years. Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the gallant fighting of the military and naval forces, the diligence and assiduity of our servants of the state, and the devoted service of our 100 million people, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. That, of course, was the speech by Japanese Emperor Hirohito on the 15th of August 1945 announcing Japan's surrender and the end of the Second World War. But why did it take Japan so long to surrender? According to many historians, the Axis powers really had no way of winning after 1943. The Nazi war effort was decimated after the Battle of Stalingrad came to a crushing defeat in February 1943. The Allies had invaded Sicily in July that year and then the Italian mainland 2 months later. The Japanese launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and had gone on to rout European colonies across Asia, but its war effort was failing after 1943. After Berlin was surrounded and Hitler took his own life, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally in May 1945. Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader, had been ousted and put in charge of a small, Nazi-dominated puppet state. But in April 1945, when he was attempting to flee to Switzerland with his mistress, he was captured by communist partisans, executed, and his body was strung up by the heels outside a petrol station in Milan. But Japan fought on. So, on the 26th of July, 1945, the Allies met in Potsdam, in Germany, where the United Kingdom, the United States, and China called for Japan to surrender unconditionally or meet prompt and utter destruction. The communique was not signed by the Soviet Union, however, which at the time still had a neutrality pact with Japan. In Tokyo, some thought they could get a better deal by going through Moscow, hoping the Soviets might mediate a more conditional surrender on better terms. Others in Japan's war cabinet wanted to fight on until the bitter end, regardless of the consequences, with a Gotterdammerung spirit. War Minister Kurijiika Anami famously said that Japan's entire destruction would be better than surrender. Would it, he pondered, not be wondrous for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower? But the Allied threat of prompt and utter destruction produced no real outcome. So, on August 6, 1945, the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another was dropped on Nagasaki. The same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The die was cast. The Japanese government, on August 10th, communicated its intention to surrender under the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. That wasn't announced to the Japanese public until August 15th. Even then, there were attempts to fight on. Members of the War Ministry launched an ill-fated coup attempt against the Emperor on the night of August 14th. Japan's surrender would be formally signed on the 2nd of September 1945. The events of August 1945 are timely. The Christopher Nolan-directed film about Robert Oppenheimer, who led the atomic bomb developments in Los Alamos, was the blockbuster hit this summer. The film sparked a renewal of debates about why the 2 atomic bombs were dropped. Was it to finish off the war early, sparing hundreds of thousands of lives? Or was it merely meant to impress upon the Soviet Union the power of the United States? The leaders of Japan and South Korea visited the United States last week for an historic trilateral meeting, a sign of the closeness between America and Japan today, but also a possible rapprochement between Japan and South Korea. Imperial Japan's 35-year colonization of the Korean Peninsula before and during the Second World War remains a sore that still drives a wedge between the two neighbors. To talk about the events of August 1945, I'm joined by Barrett Tillman, an authority on air warfare in the Second World War and the author of more than 40 non-fiction and fiction books on military topics. His latest is When the Shooting Stopped, August 1945. It's a fantastic read that explores the characters and decisions behind Japan's eventual surrender that month and the events that took place afterwards. In this episode, we discuss why it took Japan so long to surrender, what might have happened had it surrendered earlier, the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, and a potential third on Japan, the Soviet Union's invasion of Manchuria, Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of Japan, and what happened after Japan surrendered. Barrett, thanks for coming on the show. Let's kick off with the obvious question. Why did it take Japan so long to surrender? Nazi Germany had surrendered in May, fascist Italy had collapsed, the Axis was done for. From the outside, it must have been apparent that Japan's battle was lost.
The difference between Japan and Germany, especially as far as the decisions to surrender, is found in the distinct differences between the rulers in Nazi Germany and the ruling clique in Japan. Of course, Adolf Hitler was a dictator, and therefore, once he was dead, whatever the remaining military capabilities were of the Third Reich, there was almost no incentive to continue fighting, and that therefore the European War ended in early May 1945. In Japan, essentially 6 men were in charge. The Supreme War Council was composed largely of current and former Japanese admirals and generals. It included the active chiefs of the Japanese Army and the Navy, the foreign minister, the interior minister, and a couple of others. Because they were so heavily populated with current and former military leaders, the Bushido mindset prevailed. And from probably June or so of 1945, the council was evenly divided 3-3 between those who favored an accommodation with the Allies, especially in regard to the Potsdam Declaration requiring unconditional surrender, and those who wanted to fight to the very end. And if you look at the Strategic Bombing Survey interviews, which I accessed for August 1945, you'll find that the most frequent statement among the holdouts was that forcing the Allies into an invasion of the Japanese home islands would be so costly that the United States, Britain, and its allies would agree to a settlement rather than an invasion. And therefore, it required the unprecedented move by Emperor Hirohito to intervene personally and override those who were in favor of continuing the war.
The US drops the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August the 6th and 9th. How important were they for forcing Japan to surrender?
There's still controversy about the effect of the atom bombs, but from a historiography viewpoint, that is the study of history, I realized in researching the book, August 1945, that for about 30 years, the debate had been conducted in an information vacuum. And only in the early to mid 1970s were the State Department and US military decrypts, the code breaking, fully released. And therefore, it became apparent finally that President Harry Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were reading Tokyo's mail. And they knew that while the third-party negotiations were going on, primarily via Switzerland, that Tokyo was also in touch with the Stalin regime in Moscow, asking the Soviets to intervene on Japan's behalf for better terms. What was not known in Tokyo, of course, is that by July of 1945, the Soviets' massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria was still building up and was about ready to kick off on August 9th, which by coincidence was the same day as the Nagasaki bomb.
I remember when I was a university undergraduate having to study the historiographical debates on the atomic bomb. Were they dropped primarily to finish off the war early and save lives? or as intimidation as a sign to the Soviet Union of American power. Have those debates changed more recently? And what's your opinion on those?
I've not been following the argument very closely since the book was published last year, but I have a couple of distinguished colleagues, including Richard B. Frank, who's one of the preeminent historians of the Pacific War, with his definitive history of the Guadalcanal campaign and his later book called Downfall, which examines the Allied plans for the invasion of Japan, which was to begin in late 1945, and much of the diplomatic background as well. And Rich has said that in his discussions with previous historians, such as John Dower, who believed for years and years that the bombs were unnecessary, there's been enough retroactive and retrospective examination of the documents to admit to a greater extent than before that the bombs were in fact a crucial factor. And if anyone still believes that the bombs were intended to deter the Soviets, it's simply not true, because in researching August 1945, when the shooting stopped, I found that the United States continued providing the Soviets with military equipment that would have been useful in invading the northern Japanese islands, which in fact they did. In August 1945, Japan occupied portions of the Sakhalin Islands, which are the most northern in the Japanese home islands. So the fact that the United States continued providing the Russians with the means of occupying Japanese territory simply cuts the legs from under the notion that the bombs were intended to impress Moscow.
And the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria on August the 8th. What was Stalin's rationale for this? What impact did it have on Japan?
The rationale, as far as I know, was twofold. Number one, the Soviets had massive superiority on the borders of Manchuria, enough to launch a three-front attack that steamrolled most of the Japanese and the small local army, the Manchukuo regime. So Manchuria was a grape ripe for plucking. Secondly, advantages that Manchuria held were considerable. They included the Yalu River for hydroelectric power. It included timber. It included minerals. So all of that was beneficial to the Soviet Union, which in fact dismantled some of the Manchurian factories and moved them to Russia. So the Soviets had every reason to believe that occupying Manchuria was a small risk operation.
And you mentioned Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of Japan. Can you give us a sense of what was the actual plan? What would have taken place? Were there any timelines imagined? And also your opinion, was it a feasible operation?
The short answer is yes, it was feasible, although the Allies recognized that it would have incurred immense cost. Downfall was a two-phase operation. The first was planned for November of 1945, Operation Olympic, which involved seizing the southernmost of the Japanese home islands, Kyushu. And once that was accomplished, the Allies had a massive base right next door to Honshu and the other home islands, beyond what was already assembled at Okinawa, about 350 miles south of of Kyushu. The second phase, Operation Coronet, tentatively was planned for the spring of 1946, most likely sometime in March. And how long that might have taken is still a matter of speculation. But as far as Allied casualties, it's little known that leading up to the launch of Operation Downfall, the U.S. Army, which obtained medals for all the U.S. armed services, ordered, I think, something over 300,000 Purple Hearts. And that supply lasted up to the Vietnam War before a new batch was minted. So to put 300,000 or 400,000 Purple Hearts in context, the total American casualties in the Second World War were about 405,000. So essentially, we're looking at the prospects for Japan doubling the number of American casualties in the war.
And for Downfall, that would have been a primarily American-led operation, or with British and Commonwealth. And would the Soviet Union have taken part in that as well?
No, the Soviets were not in a position to participate in Olympic or Coronet because they lacked the sea lift, and they were not required. As you properly note, the larger scheme of Downfall involved British Commonwealth forces, especially the Royal Navy's contribution, the British Pacific Fleet, but it also included Australian and New Zealand forces going ashore. So even though Operation Downfall was largely an American operation, it still planned on relying upon some high quality troops from Britain, Australia, and New Zealand.
There's a failed coup attempt in Tokyo. What happened during this incident? Was it always bound to be a failure, or was there a minute chance that it might have actually been successful?
In my opinion, which basically is formed on the groundbreaking work done by the late historian John Toland in the 1970s, the so-called palace coup that night was never going to succeed. It was perpetrated by fairly junior members of the Imperial Guard Regiment, the first infantry regiment, which historically had provided security for the palace and the emperors and his family. What happened was that some diehard junior officers learned that Emperor Hirohito had made a recording that day intended for broadcasting the next day, August 15th, announcing the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. So the extremely ambitious plotters killed one of the steadfast generals who was the de facto commander of the palace guard, and issued a written statement, a forgery in his name. And they also attempted to find where the emperor's recording had been stored so that they could destroy it. Once that scheme fell through, the plotters basically called it quits, although they did try to assassinate some cabinet members elsewhere in Tokyo, and most of the plotters committed suicide before the next day.
And the emperor's statement on August the 15th was, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, the most famous understatement. When this was made, how did the Japanese people react? Was there an eagerness in society for the war to be over? Was there disbelief that Japan had surrendered?
That's an excellent question, David, and the answer is both. The common people were, by August of 1945, fully aware that Tokyo had been lying to them all along. They saw the cloud of Allied aircraft, especially U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces planes, operating with very little resistance over the home islands. Those in metropolitan areas knew that, if not the actual percentage, they knew that a very large portion of the nation's urban industrial areas had been burned out. You mentioned the Tokyo firestorm, inflicted by about 320 B-29s on the night of March 9th and 10th, which killed about 85,000 people. Incidentally, that number was not, as sometimes has been stated, more than were killed by the atomic bombs. But imagine what that looked like and what that smelled like on the morning of March 10th, when the emperor drove in his limousine to survey parts of his capital. So despite the immense destruction wrought by American air power in March, it still took 5 to 6 months of additional bombing and the two nuclear weapons before the emperor was convinced to intervene.
And to consider a slight counterfactual, do you think the events of August 1945 would have been different had Roosevelt not passed away a few months earlier and Winston Churchill had not lost the general election in Britain?
That's a good question. My answer to both is no. Roosevelt had set the overall American and therefore Allied policy with Churchill of unconditional surrender. And Germany, of course, was required to meet that standard. The one aspect of unconditional surrender that was not enforced in Japan was that the emperor could remain on the throne. However, that was largely window dressing, because the terms to which Tokyo agreed specified that the emperor would be subordinate to the overall Allied Supreme Commander, who, of course, became General Douglas MacArthur.
And the United States did have a third atomic bomb ready to be dropped, I believe, on August the 19th. I mean, first, is there any evidence that Washington and Harry Truman would have decided to drop it had Tokyo not surrendered a few days earlier? And did the Japanese know that the Americans had more bombs?
No, I do not think that Tokyo had any idea of how many atomic bombs we possessed. Although, researching further in the book August 1945, it became apparent that the Manhattan Project was going to ramp up production of nuclear weapons, some of which might have been used in a tactical role for Operation Downfall, in order to isolate the invasion landing areas from Japanese reinforcements. But you're right, August 19th was the approximate date likely to see the third bomb. But remember that President Truman was out of town. He was attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany when the decision went down through the chain of command. And he issued a directive that the third bomb, what Colonel Paul Tibbets of the B-29 Command called the third shot, would only be released on Truman's specific say-so. But the first two were already decided upon. So that's a long way around the block to say that I see no evidence that the bombs would not have been dropped simply because Roosevelt and Truman were no longer in position.
So Japan surrenders on August the 15th, but the occupation by the Allies doesn't begin until August the 28th. And the fighting doesn't really end with the surrender. There's still skirmishes between Japanese troops and Americans. Can you give a few examples, and why were Japanese soldiers prepared to fight on?
The combat that occurred between August 15th and later that month was fairly widespread. A little bit of it occurred in the Philippines, where holdout Japanese survivors refused to surrender. There was also skirmishing in some places, more than skirmishes on the Asian mainland, but primarily that involved radical Japanese commanders in China who were reluctant to comply with the surrender. And toward that end, it's not widely realized that Emperor Hirohito issued a separate rescript from the one that was broadcast on August 15th. He also had one printed and issued to the armed forces because he and his supporters in the cabinet knew that some Japanese military, especially the army, would not want to abide by the surrender, and therefore the extra order from Hirohito was more widely distributed, and it did take effect.
The additional script called on the soldiers to lay down their arms.
That's correct.
How complicated was the process of actually bringing the conflict to the end and arranging the reconstruction of Japan, especially in those later days in August 1945?
The number of Japanese military who surrendered before VJ Day varies. It's between 35 and 50,000. Of course, they were spread across the Asia Pacific theater. The number of dead Japanese in the home islands was something over 350,000, of course, largely from the Allied air campaign. But giving a broader view of the situation in the home islands after the formal surrender, as you note, the Japanese population had been on limited rations at least since the spring of 1945. And in fact, there were food riots in Tokyo in May, and I do not have the figures at hand for how much that expanded through August. But one of the early priorities of the US government was shipping enough grain to Japan to avert a famine in early 1946. So those merchant ships set sail almost immediately from the West Coast. But as you note, it was extremely difficult to make up the difference in Japan after months and months of reduced rations. And I do not have the figures at hand as to how many deaths accrued from the food shortage in early 46, but it certainly would have been much, much higher if the Allies had been required to invade.
And obviously, with the close of the Second World War, it doesn't stop the bloodshed in East Asia and Southeast Asia, the Chinese Civil War. There's conflict in Korea, of course, conflicts in Southeast Asia. But one of the outcomes of Japan's delayed surrender was the Soviet Union got a foothold in Manchuria, from where it could support the Chinese Communist Party and the North Korean Communists. Is there an argument that the Chinese Communists would have had a more difficult time in their civil war, and the Korea's Communists might have failed had Tokyo surrendered, say, in July 1945 rather than August 1945?
My guess, and it's just a guess, is that it would not have made a great deal of difference. The Soviets and the Chinese Communists already knew the shape of the post-war world that they preferred. And it's possible that had Tokyo surrendered a month earlier, that the situation on the Asian mainland, especially in China and Korea, might have been somewhat different. One assumes that a surrender in July would have negated the Soviet, what's called Operation August Storm, the invasion of Manchuria. But that's not to say that Stalin would have forestalled it, because he still saw the same advantages in July that he could obtain in August.
Well, I want to thank you again, Barrett, for coming on the show. And perhaps you can tell listeners about your book and maybe what you're working on at the moment.
Certainly. The book is August 1945, the day the shooting stopped. The book, as you now know, having read it, is not merely an overview from Washington and Tokyo, but it involves dozens of interviews I've conducted, some of them as far back as the 1970s. So it's a micro view of the world as it existed in August 1945. It's published by Osprey in the UK. It's available on Amazon and in a variety of bookstores. The current project is a tentative biography of one of my dear friends, General Joe Foss, who, despite what the Marine Corps says, remains the top flying leatherneck fighter ace of all time, rather than Gregory Boyington. And I'm still in touch with the Foss family and looking forward to pursuing that project.
Thanks for listening to Asian Centuries. For more information, go to asiancenturiespod.substack.com, and to see videos of episodes, search Asian Centuries on YouTube. You can also follow on Facebook and Twitter. And if you can, please leave a review and subscribe wherever you find this podcast. See you next time.